I'll be so glad when the sun goes down.
When the sun goes down.
I'll be so glad when the sun.
An important aspect to study is how education during the Matha, or the African Holocaust, came about. Our ancestors' quest for knowledge was met with serious opposition and obstacles, and we need to shed light on what our ancestors had to deal with to counter their barring from education and learning. Booker T. Washington, one of the most celebrated figures of his time, explains in his autobiography, Up from Slavery, I had no schooling whatsoever while I was a slave, though I remember on several occasions I went as far as the schoolhouse door with one of my young mistresses to carry her books. The picture of several dozen boys and girls in a classroom engaged in study made a deep impression upon me, and I had the feeling that to get into the schoolhouse and study is the way it would be as same as getting into paradise. Washington talks about his recollections and intense desire in which our ancestors showed for an education. He said the whole race was trying to go to school. The day and night schools were filled. There was a great ambition of older people trying to learn the Bible before they died. He said day school, night school, Sunday school were always crowded, and often many been turned away for want of room. But Washington also talks about how the older he got, he became convinced that no education should come only from books alone, but from people and experiences. During his time at Hampton, which was an incredible act of self-determination for him to get there, he learned that to secure an education did not mean freedom from manual labor, that for the independence and self-reliance one had to understand the importance of labor. Washington was troubled by the fact that many of his people really thought they could escape hardship by getting an education. Washington said there was one student that mastered arithmetic and banking and a discount, but found out that no one in his neighborhood ever had a bank account. Aside from this, we wanted to give them such a practical knowledge of some industry, together with the spirit of industry, thrift, and economy, that they would be sure of knowing how to make a living after they left the institution. We wanted to teach them to study actual things instead of mere books alone. From the very beginning at Tuskegee, I was determined to have students not only know the agriculture and domestic work, but have them erect their own buildings. My plan was to have them, while performing their service, taught the latest and best methods of labor, so that the school would not only get the benefit of their efforts, but the students themselves would be taught to see not only unity in labor, but beauty and dignity. Would be taught, in fact, how to lift labor up from mere drudgery and toil, and would learn to love work for its own sake. My plan was not to teach them to work in the old way, but to show them how to make the forces of nature, air, water, steam, electricity, horsepower, assist them in their labor. One man may go into a community prepared to supply the people there with an analysis of Greek sentences. The community may not take the time to prepare for that, or feel the need of Greek analysis, but it may feel its need of bricks and houses and wagons. In another one of Washington's timeless literary works, The Future of the American Negro, Washington has another account of another student at his Tuskegee Institute when he said a young man didn't know any classifications of his father's farm. He didn't know about the horses or any livestock there. It never seemed to have entered his mind that his father's farm was the place to make his chemistry, mathematics, and literature penetrate and reflect itself in every acre of land, bushel of corn, every cow and pig. Washington beautifully articulated, boys have been taken from the farms and educated in law, theology, Greek, and Hebrew, educated in everything else except the very subject that they should know most about. Washington further articulates another example of his concerns for his people about education when he said, some time ago, when we decided to make tailoring a part of our training at the Tuskegee Institute, I was amazed to find that it was almost impossible to find in the whole country an educated colored man who could teach the making of clothing. We could not find them by the score who could teach astronomy, theology, grammar, or Latin. We could find them by the score who could teach astronomy, theology, grammar, or Latin, but almost none could instruct in the making of clothing, something that had to be used by every one of us every day in the year. But despite his concerns, he had a lot of success at his Tuskegee Institute that he wanted to achieve in reversing these trends he witnessed. He gets largely criticized for needing white support to build it, but we have to understand the times he was living in. He made the most of what he had by building up a mini civilization at Tuskegee to the point where Africans all over the world was being educated there. He became more optimistic about the future of his people in saying, perhaps the most encouraging thing in connection with the lifting up of the Negro in this country is the fact that he knows that he is down and wants to get up. He knows that he is ignorant and wants to get light. He fills every schoolhouse and every church which is open for him. He is willing to follow leaders when he is once convinced that the leaders have his best interests at heart. Frederick Douglass, formerly enslaved, a political statesman and leader of his time, in his first autobiography titled The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, widely considered one of the best literary works of his time, Douglass expressed beautifully as well as the struggles for our ancestors to get an education. Frederick Douglass states as he was learning how to read from his master's wife, his master found out and instructed her to stop teaching him how to read. He said it was unsafe, unlawful to teach a slave to read. To use his own words further, he said, if you teach a nigger an inch, he'll take a mile. A nigger should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. Now, said he, if you teach that nigger how to read, there will be no keeping him. It will forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. These words sank deep in my heart, stirred up sentiments within that land slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the path from slavery to freedom. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I least expected it. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose, at whatever cost of trouble, to learn how to read. Douglass used his creative ways of learning by avoiding the suspicions of him having books to read. His mistress taught him the alphabet, and he would use little white boys he met in the street and convert them to teachers, and with that he succeeded in learning how to read. When he had to go run errands, he always had a book with him and would always get a lesson in before his return. He expressed the more he read, the more he was led to abhor and detest his enslavers. He said, I could regard them in no other light than a band of successful robbers who had left their homes and had gone into Africa and stolen us from our homes, and in a strange land reduced us to slavery. I loathed them as being the meanest as well as the most wicked of men. As I read and contemplated the subject, behold, that was discontentment for which Master Hugh had predicted would follow my learning to read had already come, to torment and sting my soul to unutterable anguish. I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but not a ladder upon which to get out. In moments of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I had often wished myself a beast. He talked about how he learned to read. He loved the fact that he taught his fellow enslaved brothers and sisters to read. He stated, I look back to those Sundays with an amount of pleasure not to be expressed. They were great days of my soul. The work of instructing my dear fellow slaves was the sweetest engagement with which I was ever blessed. Frederick Douglass beautifully articulated in this book that still carries weight today in saying, I have found that to make a contented slave, it is necessary to make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision and, as far as possible, to annihilate the power of reason. He must be able to detect no inconsistencies in slavery. He must be made to feel that slavery is right, and he can be brought to that only when he ceases to be a man. The example of Frederick Douglass shows the creativity and desire to learn and read against all odds in order to achieve freedom and the importance of it. He knew that was one of the most powerful tools to liberation, and he also aided in teaching his fellow brothers and sisters the importance of it as well. Using Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington as two individuals that were formerly enslaved really validates the trials of Africans in the Holocaust in America and their quest for education. And in his great work, Carter G. Woodson, in his book Education of the Negro Prior to 1861, really validates this. Carter G. Woodson says, of how far the enlightenment of Negroes have progressed before the close of the 18th century is better obtained from the reports of teachers and missionaries who were working among them. Appealing to the Negroes of Virginia around 1755, Benjamin Fawcett addressed them as intelligent people, commanding them to read and study the Bible for themselves. Mr. Davies, then a member of the Society of Promoting the Gospel Among the Poor, reported that there were multitudes of Negroes in different parts of Virginia who were willing, eagerly, desirous to be instructed and embraced every opportunity of acquainting themselves with the doctrine of the gospel. And though they were generally very little help needed to be learned for them to read, yet to his surprise, many of them, by dint of application, had made such progress that they could intelligently read a plain author and especially their Bible. On Saturday evenings and Sundays, his home was crowded, complaining that his stock was exhausted and that he had to turn away many disappointed. He urged his friends to send him other suitable books, for nothing else could be a greater inducement of their industry to learn to read. Equally convincing as the education progressed of the colored race were the high attainments of those Negroes who, despite the fact that they had little opportunity, surpassed in intellect a large number of white men in their time. Negroes were serving as salesmen, keeping accounts, managing plantations, teaching and preaching, and had intellectually advanced to the extent that by 15 or 20% of their adults could then at least read. Most of the talented class became preachers, and this was the only calling even conditionally open to the persons of African blood. Lafayette, a promoter of the emancipation and improvement of the colored people, and a member of the New York Manumission Society, visited these schools in 1824 on his return to the United States. He was bidden welcome by an 11-year-old pupil in well-chosen and significant words. After spending the afternoon inspecting the schools, the general pronounced them the best disciplined and the most interesting schools of children he had ever seen. The fact that some of the Negroes were able and willing to share the responsibility of enlightening their people caused a large number of philanthropists to come to the rescue of those who had to depend on charity. Furthermore, of the many achievements claimed for the colored schools of Philadelphia, for example, none were considered more significant than that they produced teachers qualified to carry this work. 11 of the 16 colored schools in Philadelphia in 1822 were taught by teachers of African descent, and in 1830 the system was practically in the hand of Negroes. Such philanthropy, however, did not come general in Virginia. The process of Negro education there was decidedly checked by the rapid development of discontent among Negroes ambitious to emulate the example of Toussaint L'Ouverture. During the first quarter of the 19th century, that Commonwealth tolerated much less enlightenment of the colored people than a benevolent element allowed them in the other border states. The custom of teaching colored paupers children apprenticed by church wardens was prohibited by statute immediately after Gabriel Prosper's insurrection in 1800. Negroes eager to learn were thereafter largely restricted to private tutoring and instruction offered in Sabbath schools. After 1838, Virginia Negroes had practically no chance to educate themselves. Encouraging as has been the movement to enlighten the Negroes, there has always been at work certain reactionary forces which impeded the intellectual progress of the colored people. Most slaves who were once counted as valuable on account of their ability to read and write the English language were thereafter considered unfit for service in the South and branded as objects of suspicion. Moreover, within a generation or so, Negroes began to retrograde because they had been deprived of every elevating influence. The white people of the South resorted to their old habit of answering their critics with the bold assertion that the effort of enlightening the blacks would prove futile on account of their mental inferiority. When the increase in intelligence among Negroes in the South, however, observed in the abolition literature, how the condition of the American slaves differed from that of ancient servants and even from what has been in the United States, when they fully realized their intolerable conditions compared with that of white men who were clamoring for liberty and equality, that rankled in the bosoms of slaves, that insurrectory passion productive for the daring uprisings which made the chances for the enlightenment of Negro people poorer than ever had been in the history of this country. The more alarming insurrections of the first quarter of the 19th century were the immediate cause of the most reactionary measures. It was easily observed that these movements were due to the mental improvement of the colored people during the struggles for the rights of man. Discussions about the Gabriel Prosper's plot in 1800, St. George Tucker said, "Our sole security then consists in their ignorance of this power and their means of using it, a security which we have lately found is not to be relied on, and which, as small as it is, every day diminishes. Every year adds to the number of those who can read and write, and the increase in knowledge is the principal agent in involving the spirit we have to fear." Denmark Vesey had learned to read and write, had accumulated an estate worth $8,000, and had purchased his freedom in 1800. Jack Purcell, an accomplice of Vesey, weakened in the crisis and confessed. He said that Vesey was in the habit of reading to him all the passages of the newspapers that related to Haiti, and apparently every accessible pamphlet that had any connection with slavery. The statement of the governor of South Carolina also shows the influence of the educated Negro. This official felt that Monday, the slave of Mr. Gill, was the most daring conspirator. Being able to read and write, he attained an extraordinary and dangerous influence over his fellows. Permitted by his owner to occupy a house in the central part of the city, he was afforded hourly opportunities for the exercise of his skill on those who were attracted to his shop by business or favor. Southerners of all types thereafter attacked the policy of educating Negroes. Men who had expressed themselves either one way or the other changed their attitude when it became evident that abolition literature in the hands of slaves would not only make them dissatisfied, but cause them to take drastic measures to secure liberty. Those who had emphasized the education of Negroes to increase their economic efficiency were largely converted. In consequence of this tendency, state after state enacted more stringent laws to control the situation. Missouri passed in 1817 an act to regulate the traveling and assembly of slaves and as to make them ineffective in making headway against the white people by insurrection. Of course, in doing so, the reactionaries deprived them of the opportunities of helpful associations and of attending school. By 1819, much dissatisfaction had arisen from the seeming danger of various colored schools in Virginia. The General Assembly, therefore, passed a law providing that there should be no more assemblages of slaves or free Negroes or mulattoes mixing or associating with such slaves for teaching them reading and writing. The problem in Louisiana was first to keep out intelligent persons who might inform the slaves as to cause them to rise. According to 1814, state passed a law prohibiting the immigration of free persons of color into the Commonwealth. In 1830, therefore, Louisiana enacted another measure providing that whoever should read, print, publish, or distribute anything having a tendency to produce discontent amongst the slaves should, on conviction, therefore, be imprisoned at hard labor or life or sudden death at the discretion of the court. Yielding to the demands of slave owners, Georgia passed a law later provided that any Negro who should teach another to read or write should be punished by fine and whipping. If a white person should so commit this, he should be punished with a fine not exceeding $500 and possible imprisonment. In Virginia, there was the prohibition did not then extend to freedmen. There was enacted in 1831 a law providing that any meeting of free Negroes or mulattoes for teaching them reading or writing should be considered an unlawful assembly. To break up assemblies for the purpose of any judge or justice of the peace could issue a warrant to apprehend such persons and inflict corporal punishment not exceeding 20 lashes. White persons convicted of teaching Negroes how to read and write were to be fined $50 and might be imprisoned for 2 months. After Nat Turner's rebellion, many other states prohibited Negro preachers from even preaching to their congregations. Following the example of Delaware in 1832, Florida passed a law prohibiting all meeting of Negroes except those for divine worship at a church or place attended by white persons. Florida made the same regulations more stringent in 1846 when she enjoyed the freedom of a state. Alabama had some difficulties getting a satisfactory law. In 1832, this Commonwealth enacted a law imposing a fine from $250 to $500 on persons who should attempt to educate the Negro whatsoever. Situations in many parts of the South was just as Barry portrayed it in the Virginia House of Delegates in 1832 when he said, "We have as far as possible closed every avenue which by light may enter their minds. If we should extinguish the capacity to see the light, our work would have been completed. They would then be on a level with the beasts of the field, and we should be safe. I am not certain that we would not do it if we could find out the process and that of the plea of necessity." It had then come to pass that in the South, once there were once considerable number of intelligent Negroes, they had become exceedingly scarce or disappeared from certain sections altogether. The reactionary tendency was in no sense confined to the southern states. Laws were passed in the North to prevent migration of Negroes to that section. The education at certain places was discouraged. In fact, in the proportion of the conditions of the South made it necessary for free blacks to flee from oppression. The people of the North grew less tolerant on account of the large numbers of those who crowded the towns and cities of free states near the border. The anti-slavery societies at once found it necessary to devote their time to the economic condition of the refugees to make them acceptable to white people rather than to direct their attention to mere education. The elimination of the Christian teachers of the Negro race and the prevention of the immigration of workers in the northern states rendered the blacks helpless and dependent upon a few benevolent white ministers for the slave communities. While attendant ministers and officials whose work often lay upon to their servants, many of the race learned by contact and observation. Shrewd Negroes sometimes slipped stealthily in the back streets where they studied under a private teacher or attended a school hidden from zealous execution of the law. C.G. Parsons was informed that although poor masters did not venture to teach their slaves, occasionally one with a thirst for knowledge secretly learned the rudiments of education without any instruction. While on a tour through parts of Georgia, E.P. Burke observed that notwithstanding the great precaution which was taken to prevent the mental improvement of the slaves, many of them stole knowledge enough to enable them to read and write with ease. Intelligent Negroes secretly communicated to their fellow men what they knew. Traveling to Mississippi in 1852, Olmsted found another group of slaves, of all whom could read, whereas the master himself was entirely literate. He took much pride, however, in praising his loyal, capable, and intelligent Negroes. More schools for slaves existed than white men ever knew, for it was difficult to find them. Frederick Douglass heard of secret schools for slaves during her visit to Charleston, but she had extreme difficulty in finding such an institution. Many of them had in slavery either acquired the rudiments of education, or developed sufficient skill to outwit the most desired pursuers. Owing so much to mental power, no man was more effective than the successful fugitive in instilling into the minds of his people the value of education. On Sundays, the schoolhouses and churches were crowded by eager seekers, many of whom lived miles away. Among these earnest students, a traveler saw an aged couple, more than 80 years old.
It should be widely known that African intelligence, through the most brutal oppression in human history, survived against all odds. Without being given the full exposure to Western education, enslaved Africans had to rely on their innate intelligence to provide for themselves, their families, and society as a whole. In her book, Medical Apartheid, Harriet A. Washington explains that all these perceptions of scientific racism, although convenient for the slave owner and physician, were highly illogical articles of faith. So was the supposed inferior intelligence of blacks, because planners and doctors behaved in many contexts as though they held the abilities and judgment of blacks in high regard, employing enslaved Africans in responsible positions such as nurses, cooks, herbalists, midwives, overseers, leaders of work gangs, accountants, and operators of farm and factory implements. Owners reaped the profits from the many patents of the enslaved Africans' inventions, and physicians used enslaved Africans as a skilled apprentice, who often went on to practice themselves independently. White households depended on the specialized skills and discernment of the enslaved Africans, not the other way around. Black contributions to early American medicine included research. In fact, enslaved African doctors sometimes developed medications that were so highly prized as to garner them fame, fortune, and their freedom. In 1729, Lieutenant Governor Gooch of Virginia authorized the payment of £60 to manumit an unnamed Negro man. Gooch declared that his mixture of pharmacologically active roots and bark have proved an effective syphilis remedy. In 1751, South Carolina enslaved African doctor named Caesar developed several medical innovations, including an almost foolproof snakebite antidote. The cure featured a shrub called plantain and horehound, a plant that derived its name from Egyptian priests who called it the seed of Horus, the Egyptian god of sun and virtue, mixed with sassafras, wood ashes, and tobacco. African herbalists investigated, tested, and perfected the use of plants they found in the New World for the new ailments that afflicted both blacks and whites. They adapted medicines and techniques they brought with them, such as the stimulant coconut, which was adopted so widely that it eventually supplied the main ingredient for Coca-Cola. In 1721, an enslaved African named Onesimus proposed a novel medical technique that saved the city of Boston from a dread smallpox epidemic and provided the first important medical advance in the New World. In his book, Black Inventors, Keith C. Holmes explains and lists countless examples of between 1700 and 1899 an explosion of prolific and profound black inventors changed the course of history in the United States. The 20th century saw a complete change in the energy sources of developing nations, from physical power to electric power and from petroleum to atomic energy. Now we are experiencing the developments of alternative environmentally friendly energy sources known as green energy.
This proves that against all odds, in a strange land, under the most brutal treatment of humans in world history, African people survived and used reading, learning, and their intelligence as weapons to fight for their freedom. Without it, you would have never gotten the resistance that Africans displayed against their enslavers.